Yes. So this is going to be Unit 7. Can somebody shut the door over there? A little loud. For Unit 7, it's all about natural selection, which is going to be, you know, something you've probably learned a little bit about in your introductory biology class back when you were a sophomore or maybe even a freshman. We'll probably be, drilling down a little bit deeper than before. Historically, teaching of evolution has had a little bit of controversy to it, but that's died down a little bit because most people accept it these days. And, you think about it, evolution is why we need a new flu shot every year. Evolution is what the coronavirus is kind of doing. Evolution is why we have bacteria that's resistant to antibiotics. So a lot of people think about it over this long time span only, but it happens on a human time scale with things that reproduce very quickly. No matter what you think about it, it really does affect your everyday life, okay? So here's a big quote from Darwin from his original book. It basically says that natural selection is happening daily, even hourly, throughout the world. Every variation, even the slightest variation, rejecting what's bad and preserving and adding up all that's good, it works silently and insensibly. That means it doesn't really have a goal, okay? Anytime there's an opportunity for it to happen, it should be happening. He said that we don't really see it until the slow changes of time have marked things off, but we actually do, okay? So a lot of times people will take what a famous sort of like a scientist that discovers something or comes up with, and they'll take every word they say as sort of like the final word on everything. But there were some mistakes he made, but that doesn't like dismiss all of his work. So some people will find like one little thing that he said that was wrong, and they'll be like, well, the whole thing's wrong. So just watch out for that kind of thinking. Okay, you probably know this from his your video yesterday that Darwin took this incredible global voyage here. Okay, and most of his big time observations were made in the Galapagos Islands. I'd love to make my way down there someday. He was an English naturalist. At the time, there were these people who were educated and usually from well-to-do backgrounds that would just be like, I don't really need to have a job, so I'm just going to like study nature. And that's what they mean by naturalist. So naturalist is kind of maybe what we would call like field biologists these days. So they would just go out and like describe things and say like, well, I discovered this new insect or this new species. So much of the world was uncatalogued at the time that was kind of a cool thing to do. And remember, this is English, okay? And so the English Empire was broad and wide, so you can kind of see they went to some colonial, what would you call it, possessions, okay? Some of the commonwealths like Australia and South Africa. And so not everywhere they went was related to that, but they did go on sort of what you truly would call a world tour of the Southern Hemisphere. So seeing all these things and doing all this field work allowed him to kind of come up with some of his famous work. So what did he look at? He was really interested in biogeography. Biogeography is like, why are some species here and some species there? Do they move? How are they related to the species next door to them? And so here is something similar to what he saw. These are the actual finches from those islands, and you can kind of see they have similar head shapes, but their beaks are drastically different. Okay? So what he guessed was these finches left the South American coast and they colonized the Galapagos Islands. So although they were able to get there, there's really not much back and forth between the mainland and the islands. Okay? And once they reached these islands, they diversified. Okay? So even the individual islands don't have a huge amount of back and forth interbreeding. So once they reached the individual collection of islands, they gave rise to new species that were specialized to eat different things on each island. Now, island biogeography is really interesting, okay? I got to live in Hawaii for a year when I was in the Navy, and that came up quite a bit. I even took my first college biology class in Hawaii, so it was really something that we talked about a lot. So, does anybody know the only mammal native to Hawaii? Well, land mammal. I like the dolphin thinking there, yeah. It's bats. Bats, because they can fly, those were the only mammals native to Hawaii. So what you saw in Hawaii were all these birds with no predators, okay? There were no snakes, there were no small mammals like cats and things like that are eating any of these birds. And a lot of the birds on Hawaii evolved to be completely defenseless, okay? They're flightless, they just walk around, living in paradise. And what happened was, when the Polynesians arrived, they brought with them pigs, okay? And they brought rats, and they brought, I don't know if they brought cats or not, but all these small animals, these small mammals, absolutely devastated the Hawaiian ecology. Hawaii didn't have any precious metals at all, so if you wanted to make something pretty, you made it out of bird feathers. So like they would make these big ornamental capes for like Hawaiian royalty. They would just catch like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of like red birds and put all these little feathers in these capes, okay? A lot of times we think of native populations, we kind of romanticize them a little bit, like Native Americans, Native Polynesians, and we're kind of like, they live at one with nature. And we kind of like Disney, movies and princesses and, what's the one with John Smith? Pocahontas. She like has all the animal friends and the mother willow and all that kind of stuff. Just because people are native doesn't mean they also don't have ecological impacts to their lifestyle. So I'm really just kind of pausing and letting you know, like, snakes are not native to Hawaii. You're not allowed to bring a snake into Hawaii, okay? If you want to bring a pet dog over, it has to quarantine forever, okay? And we really are trying to preserve these island biomes because they're so isolated that the tiniest thing can totally upset them. The Polynesian pigs they brought over, everyone thinks pigs, well, they just eat, whatever. They will eat anything. They also will eat birds and things like that in a predatory way. I grew up on a farm. We used to have chickens. We used to have pigs. Chicken walks too close to the pig pen. Chicken nugget for a pig. All right. So, island biogeography allowed Darwin to see this. Okay, I know I spent a long time on that, but it's because it's so cool. You see this also bigger islands like Australia and Madagascar have really, really unique species. Okay? All right. Darwin, of course, was very interested in these finches we've already talked about. Okay. I'm going to pause my video after a second here, and then we'll restart it. I kind of want to put you into like a little game. Groups are really hard right now, so we'll do this individually. Okay? In the notes, you have to tell me if a statement is true or false, and then you have to justify your statement. Okay, so we're just going to go through these and treat them as common misconceptions, okay? I wanted to do this as an activity, but teaching remotely kind of makes the discussion, and this is a little hard, and we've got some people that I spied the answers really, really quick over there. All right, so natural selection acts for the good of a species. A lot of times we think that like natural selection is like picking out something good, whatever good means, okay? And that's not really true. Natural selection doesn't have like a brain or a motive. The only thing it acts upon are traits that lead to survival and reproduction, okay? So just because a trait is leading to survival doesn't mean it's good for the species, okay? Here's an example. Say you have a species of predators, and they have a trait that makes them the absolute best predator out there. If they are so good at being a predator, they're going to have more offspring, they're going to have more resources, but eventually they'll get so good that they'll eat all their prey. The food will run out very suddenly, and they will starve and die, okay? There are populations of wolves and rabbits that do this, but they kind of like swing in opposite directions, okay? So we have to be careful about being the best, okay? So don't think that like natural selection has a sense of what is good and bad, okay? If all of a sudden humans having big brains was a bad feature, we would start evolving toward less intelligence, okay? I don't know how that might work, but all right. Let's go on to statement number 3. Natural selection is a process involving organisms trying to adapt, okay? Now, listen, most things on an organism level do try to adapt, okay? If you take a worm and you put it in dirt and you dump some vinegar in the dirt, the worm will try to crawl away from it, okay? It doesn't like it. That's not necessarily a population, okay? Natural selection acts upon genetic variation in a population, okay? You know, you can't say like, I'm an organism, I'm going to adapt to being a better AP biology student. I hope that I have some sort of mutation that makes me, but that's not how it works, okay? You don't like, you know, say, we have adapted, okay? That's not really what that means. Now, this is hard for us because as humans, we use our brains to adapt a lot of things to make life easier for us. I don't want to run the sweeper, so I'm going to invent a Roomba to do it for me. Okay, that's not really an adaptation, that's genetic. All right, so we adapt the environment quite a bit to fit our sort of wants and needs, and that's, I think, what leads to a lot of misconceptions about this. You know, it's cold out. I'm going to adapt myself to the environment by putting on a coat. Okay, that's still a behavioral adaptation, but that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about the entire population's genome, and are there genes in there that are able to adapt to those surroundings? If there's not, we'll probably have an extinction. Which, that was my bonus question on the test. What species going extinct would cause the most chaos? Bees was the most common answer. Bees. Okay, so that was pretty interesting. All right. Statement number 4 is also false. I'm watching the lag to make sure it's catching up. Survival of the fittest is something you've probably heard, and a lot of times when people say fittest, they're like, well, that's the strongest, fastest, healthiest, bestest, whatever you want to call it, okay, organism out there. Fit doesn't really mean like strongest, healthiest, fastest, okay? Fittest just means whoever can reproduce and survive, okay? So here's an example. We've studied this a lot in biology because it's such a great example. Sickle cell anemia is a trait. It protects you against malaria, but it can also cause severe health problems and death. So sickle cell makes you more fit, okay? But it doesn't make you like the best, okay? It doesn't make you strongest, healthiest, fastest. It makes you more fit because you're able to resist malaria, which is a huge killer in the world. It's one of the number one causes of death. And we've gotten better at it.
I think it is.
Yeah, you might be right. And you guys are going to do a case study on a way that we tried to stop malaria, which is it's not really what this is about, but I'm just trying to show you that malaria, because it's such a huge, huge killer, anything that could stop it from working, even if it's negative in sort of like a bigger picture, like sickle cell, is something that made you more fit. So don't think of fit as like, you know, the best looking Olympic athlete is the fittest, okay? The fit ones, the ones that have the most offspring that survive, okay? So if that Olympic athlete's too busy in the gym, doesn't have time to have children, they're not very fit. Yes. All right. So this is Darwin's actual drawing, okay? And what he's got here is an early version of some sort of evolutionary tree where species will branch out in different directions, okay? And this is a pretty famous illustration of his because it kind of shows a lot of what he believed in one little picture, okay? So his idea was descent, those are the children of, with modification. And some very simple observations led him to this idea. All right, so what are those ideas? So the idea is the change in genetic makeup in a population over time. If you go out on the street with a microphone and a camera and say, define evolution, they're not going to say this. They're not going to say this. They're going to say something like, that's when one animal changes into another animal. Okay? Make sure when you get into a discussion and an understanding of evolution, all it is the change in a gene pool in a population over time. Okay? It's not changing from one species to another. So, how does this work? The traits, heritable traits, change from generation to generation. Okay? So, in order for him to explain evolution, he came up with this idea called natural selection. And he used that term because artificial selection was really well known to everyone. Okay? Was that too fast? Okay. So let's talk about what natural selection is, okay? Artificial selection is pretty easy. Okay? If I'm a dairy farmer and I want to have the most productive cows, I'm going to make sure that I keep the ones that I use for milking, the ones that produce the most milk. That's artificial selection. Okay? And farmers have done this with different animals for thousands of years. Okay? The cattle in Ohio are way different than the cattle in Australia. Okay? It takes 100 acres of land to support one cow in Australia because their grass is so sparse. In Ohio, you can support a cow on 1 acre of grazing land. Okay, not in the winter, but so different breeds have different characteristics. Okay, there's different types of dairy cows. Some give a lot of milk. Those are the black and white ones. And then there are some that give milk that's really high in fat. Those are the ones that kind of have that deer color. They're called Jerseys. They make better ice cream and butter. So there's different breeds that were kind of bred for different purposes. If you go start looking at like how cheese is made, there's like, well, the cheese has to be made from milk from this particular cow because it gives this special trait. And so, anyway, artificial selection is really, really well known to everybody in the world at the time and today. Okay, same thing with dog breeds or whatever. Hunting dogs have way different characteristics than like companion dogs or herding dogs. Okay. So natural selection is where nature is doing the selecting. Okay, that's all it is. Artificial selection is humans. Okay, so for natural selection, that's where individuals with certain traits are selected for. What is selected for? That means whatever pressures there are in nature allowed them to survive and reproduce at higher rates. Now, that doesn't mean that the other individuals in the population, it's not an all or nothing proposition. It's not like the ones who are strong, they reproduce. They just have to reproduce more. Okay, so it's not an all or nothing system. So, natural selection acts only upon the variations within populations. We can't just create variation. Okay? Variation has to come from mutations. So that can be something that's not going to happen very often. So the variations that are already there are way more easy to work on than just waiting for a new mutation to happen. So, what does that mean? That means that certain phenotypes, let's just go with fur color, will increase or decrease an organism's fitness to survive. So let's say it's fur color. Maybe you have a camouflage versus one that makes you really easy to see. So the ones that are easy to see will get captured as prey more often than the ones that are camouflaged. Okay. Some other things we need to think about is it's not just who's going to get killed, it's also reproductive success. Okay? An example of this would be peacocks. Okay? If there's something in the population that makes males more attractive or less attractive, or females more attractive or less attractive, and I don't mean like attractive in the human sense, I just mean like more likely to mate. That's it, okay? But peacocks are a really good example of that. That's sexual selection kind of taken to the extreme. So like females like peacocks that really have the flashy feathers and all that sort of thing. And so that has gone, the more like the peacocks that are male and have the biggest mating displays where they put up all their feathers and they kind of dance around the female, they are more likely to get mates than the ones who like aren't as shiny and good a dancer. It's almost like picking a prom date, okay? Yes. All right. So it's shocking how much of this translates over to human behavior. Like, why do we buy big, happy red sports cars? It's like, look how fit I am to mate with you. It's a lot of it, okay? All right. So, there's a lot of that out there. Like middle school boys that jump up and hit the ceiling. They're like, "Look how strong I am. I am a good mate for you." It's like all right. So, it's funny, but don't act like women don't do the same thing. Picking out clothes and makeup and all that sort of stuff. All right. You were there for all of it. Hey, did it change your picks? Like, wow, that guy that won, he's the one. All right. All right, let's go. So, some big observations Darwin made. Okay, we laugh, but traits are heritable. That means you probably look like one or both of your parents. Okay? You have your traits that are from your parents, whether you like it or not. You know, look at me. I'm bald. I'm sorry. It's what I got. Okay? Now, we don't really see this very much in the human world. I'm sure some of your parents might want to change their mind, but more offspring are produced that can survive. Okay? It's like when if you have a sibling, they're like, only one of you can go to college. All right? More offspring are produced than can survive. Okay? What does this mean? Okay, if you think about humans are not really a good example for this. But like when animals just go out and lay a bunch of eggs. Let's go with frogs and tadpoles. It's spring. That stuff's going to start happening. They lay hundreds of eggs. They'll be lucky if only a few of them survive. So which one survives? The ones that can avoid the predators and the ones that can find the most food. Okay? Yes. Okay. So, check out that guy's ears. He looks like one of the real Pokemon. I don't know. All right. So, traits being heritable mean that characteristics can be passed down from parent to offspring. Okay? Adaptations are some sort of inherited characteristic that allows you to survive better. Okay? So these animals are both desert animals. Okay? Those big ears allow that animal to release heat out into the environment. They're like radiators. So that enhances its survival in extreme heat conditions. Camels have different ways to deal with that. Okay? So these traits for surviving in a desert are things that are going to be passed on to offspring. That's how they got to be this way. All right. So the middle school boy that can jump up and touch the ceiling the best, he is adapted to be the fittest one to reproduce with. All right. There's a lot of theories about those kinds of displays where like people will do like they're like, my genes are so good, I can do this dangerous thing and still survive. Like if you ever see like middle school boys like jump off of roofs and stuff like that. All right. More offspring are produced than can survive. This leads to competition for limited resources, okay? Which results in differential survival. That means the ones with certain traits survive more often. There's always a bit of random chance and luck involved, okay? Even the, not fit ones survive sometimes, but the fittest ones survive the most. So remember, this leads to the accumulation of more of that gene in the populations. Populations are what evolve, not individuals. Okay, populations evolve, not individuals. All right, I mentioned this already, but let's go over it real quick. So, when he first published his work, he was really worried about what everybody would think. So, what he did was wrote things so that scientists would compare natural selection to artificial selection. So we've already discussed artificial selection quite a bit. That's selectively breeding plants and animals, especially in agriculture, but also in things like pets, to encourage desirable traits. There's this really famous visual for this, and it shows the original domesticated fruits that we eat. So if you go look back at the ancestor of apples that we eat today, they were tiny little things the size of a cherry.
Couldn't that also be in part by GMOs?
Well, GMOs, genetically modified organisms, so almost, depending on how you define that, almost every single food crop that you eat, unless you go harvest it out of the woods, is a GMO. And what do I mean by that? Apples were artificially selected for, so they have been genetically modified, okay? If I plant an apple tree, I want to plant one from the seeds that have the traits I want, whether it's fruit size, fruit tastiness, or hardiness, so it can survive frost or whatever. So what you're eating, the argument could be made that it's already genetically modified. Because if you go look at some of the original uncultivated stalks that these plants came from, like corn, it just looks like a couple of seeds on the end of a weed, okay? A lot of grains look that way, okay? A lot of the fruits we eat are really like that. Grapes are like that, berries, potatoes. We've selected over thousands of years of agriculture the traits that will lead to the best crops, or the easiest ones to pick, or the ones that are going to survive problems in agriculture, like fungus or frost or whatever. So there's that sort of genetic modification. So some of what you're talking about, though, is lab genetic modifications. So in reality, not huge amounts of human crops are truly genetically modified. So let's stick. So yes, that is a factor, but good apples have been around for thousands of years compared to genetic modification. So I think I answered your question, which was a really good one. All right, let's
No, I realize that both terms kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah.
GMOs are the result of artificial selection. So.
But I think when people hear GMO, they think of people in lab coats, right?
Yeah.
And so in reality, GMOs are also people in bib overhauls and straw hats if you want to use like some stereotypes of labs and farmers. So,
Yeah.
all right. So, I think artificial is spelled. Is it spelled wrong? All right. So, in natural selection, nature selects traits that are better suited for survival and reproduction. In artificial selection, humans select traits that are desirable. Okay? And what we think is desirable is not always the best for the organism. You've probably seen like these pugs that have these breathing problems and things like that. Sometimes we pick traits that are just like not the healthiest for the organism. Okay? So, but we do it with everything from racehorses to flowers. Okay, remember the tulip craze? So that was all right. So what do we get? We get desirable domestication of plants and animals, and we pick what's desirable. Not always what's best, just what's desirable. A lot of these purebred dogs start having all kinds of health problems because they come from a very small original stock that might be interrelated. So a lot of labs will have hip problems. There's dogs with like behavioral issues. All right. Both of these lead to changes in the population. But natural selection is, you got to be careful here. Natural selection is without the influence of humans picking the breeding partners. That doesn't mean that things that humans do to the environment can't be natural selection. Okay. I think we're getting near the end here. So here's a practice problem. So we have this rodent that lives in South America, and they eat leaves and flowers and fruits that fall down from trees. Okay? A fire wipes out most of their food. And this causes them to lose body mass due to the lack of food. So because of this, later generations are thinner. Is this an example of descent with modification? Yes or no, and you're supposed to justify your answer. So you don't really have to write anything down here. But are these animals truly modified in their genetic makeup? What do you guys think? Say that again? No. What do you think would happen if all of a sudden all the plants came back? Body masses would what? Return to normal, okay? So this is not a good example of descent with modification. This is not a change in the genome. This is a change in the environment. Now, a change that would be descent with modification is maybe these things start eating, instead of soft foods like leaves, flowers, and fruits, maybe they start eating nuts or roots or something they've got to like really, really chew up. So if all of a sudden their jaw strength or their tooth structure changed, and I shouldn't say all of a sudden, if I said slowly over many generations, that would be descent with modification. Okay? So let's go ahead and stop here. And that's perfect. I just heard the bell ring. Let me stop my recording.